There is a plant that keeps count of what lands on it, and most biology classes never mention it can. By the end, you'll see how a Venus flytrap tells a walking fly from a falling raindrop, and why a single touch is never enough to spring the trap. The Venus flytrap is a small plant, no wider than a coin, with a ring of hinged green traps edged in teeth, like an ambushed predator frozen mid-yawn. Here is the part it will give you for free. One touch does nothing at all. A raindrop lands, the trap feels it, and stays wide open, because a plant that snapped at every drop and pine needle would waste every trap it owns. Only when something touches it a second time, seconds later, does the trap decide a meal has arrived. That waiting is the entire trick, and it is not patience. A plant has nothing to be patient with. It has no brain, no nerves, and no muscles, yet it behaves as if it is keeping score. The strangest part is how it remembers that first touch long enough to compare it against the second, and what it does once the numbers add up. Everything about where the Venus flytrap lives explains why it turned to hunting. In the wild, it grows in one narrow band of the American Southeast, the wet pine savannas and boggy edges of the Carolinas, where the ground is sandy, sodden, and stripped of nutrients. The soil there is so poor in nitrogen that ordinary roots cannot pull enough from it to build leaves and seeds. Most plants would simply fail in that ground. The flytrap's answer was to stop relying on the soil for the one thing it lacked, and to take that nitrogen from animals instead. It still photosynthesizes like any green plant, drinking sunlight for energy. The hunting is only about the missing minerals, not about food in the way we mean it. These bogs are also shaped by fire. Lightning-set fires sweep through every few years, burning back the shrubs and grasses that would otherwise shade the low-growing flytrap out. In the open, sunlit, freshly burned ground it thrives, and take away the fire, and the flytrap vanishes under taller plants within a decade. So this is a specialist locked to a shrinking habitat, and what it does to survive there is stranger than simply eating flies. What happens when its trap actually closes breaks a rule you were taught about plants. Look closely at a single trap, and it is not a mouth at all, it is a leaf. Each trap is two lobes of a modified leaf, hinged along a central rib, fringed with stiff spikes that interlock like the teeth of a bear trap. The Venus flytrap, known to botanists as Dionaea muscipula, is the only species in its genus, one plant, entirely alone on its own branch of the family tree. Its closest relatives are the sticky sundews and a strange underwater snap trap called the waterwheel plant, but no other plant on Earth hunts in quite this way. Inside each lobe the surface is often tinged red and dotted with tiny glands, and scattered across it stand a handful of hair-thin projections. Most traps carry 3 to 6 of these trigger hairs, each one no longer than an eyelash. They are the plant's only sense of touch. Bend one, and it registers. Leave it alone, and the trap ignores the world entirely. These hairs are not muscles and not nerves. They are living levers, and bending one sends a signal the whole trap can feel. That is the entire sensory apparatus of a predator, a few stiff hairs on a folded leaf. And the way it uses them should not be possible for something without a single nerve cell. A Venus flytrap will let a fly walk right across it and do nothing at all. That is not a mistake, and it is not slow reflexes. It is the plant checking whether the visitor is real. When something brushes one of those trigger hairs, the flytrap starts a private timer. One touch, and it waits. If nothing touches a second hair within about 20 seconds, the plant forgets the first contact and stays open. But if a second touch comes inside that window, the fly taking another step, an ant probing deeper, the two signals add up, and the trap slams shut around it. That double check is why rain, wind, and falling leaves almost never fool it. A single random tap is ignored, and only a moving animal trips 2 hairs in a row. The spacing of the hairs and the plant's insistence on 2 separate touches is a filter tuned by evolution to reject everything that is not worth the cost of closing. And closing is costly. A single trap can only open and shut a handful of times before it wears out, dies, and is replaced. So the flytrap is not being greedy or quick. It is being careful, running a simple test that a raindrop can never pass. So how does a plant with no nervous system keep count? The answer is electricity. When a trigger hair bends, cells at its base fire a pulse of charge that spreads across the trap. An electrical wave almost identical to the signal that runs down a nerve in your own body. Except here there are no nerves at all. That first pulse does not close the trap. Instead it primes it, raising the level of calcium inside the cells and leaving it briefly elevated, like a charge held on a capacitor. If a second pulse arrives before that calcium fades, the two combine, cross a threshold, and the trap snaps shut in about 1/10 of a second. That is the whole memory, a chemical level that rises with the first touch and drains away if the second never comes. This is the part the cold open promised, how a brainless plant tells a walking fly from a falling raindrop. It is counting in the only currency it has, and it does not stop at 2. To actually begin digesting, the trapped insect must keep struggling and trip the hairs about 5 separate times, each touch releasing more digestive fluid. The plant is not just catching prey, it is confirming again and again that what it caught is alive and worth dissolving. A Venus flytrap grows wild in just one small patch of the entire planet. Not across the American South, not even across a whole state. Every wild flytrap on Earth lives within about 75 miles of a single city, Wilmington, North Carolina. Outside that damp coastal circle, the plant does not occur naturally anywhere else in the world. Every flytrap in every shop and on every windowsill traces back to that one tiny homeland, a strip of boggy savanna smaller than many national parks. It is one of the most geographically restricted predators alive, hunting in a range you could drive across in a single afternoon. That homeland is also ancient. The flytrap's snaptrap lineage split from its sundew relatives tens of millions of years ago, evolving the hinged leaf and the electrical trigger long before humans existed. Yet the wider world only learned of it in the 1760s, when colonial naturalists sent dried specimens and drawings across the Atlantic, and in 1768 the naturalist John Ellis formally described it and gave it its name. Charles Darwin, a century later, studied its snapping leaves obsessively and called it one of the most wonderful plants in the world. A plant that counts, confined to a single stretch of coast, and only named in the last few centuries. We think of the Venus flytrap as a novelty, a green gadget sold in plastic cups, a toy that eats bugs. Almost no one who owns one knows that it is running a calculation every time it closes, weighing touches against a fading chemical clock, refusing to be fooled by rain it cannot afford to answer. It is easy to miss, because the whole drama happens in silence, in a plant the size of a coin, in a bog most people will never visit. And it is easy to underestimate, because plants are supposed to be passive, rooted, patient in the dull sense, not deciding, not counting, not remembering. This one does all three, with no brain to do them in. The next time one snaps shut on a fingertip and lets go empty-handed, remember that it did not fail. It checked, and it counted, and it decided you were not worth the cost.